Hello, everybody. I think we're live. Are we all here? I believe so. When you can't see your audience, we know how weird this is. Welcome. I'm Colleen Bates. I'm the moderator of this panel, and I'm going to get us started and introduce us and fire it on up. So our title is Untangling the Family Story, and basically this was an idea that I dreamed up for last year's LitFest, which got canceled, and so it's been simmering this whole year. The idea is a simple one: is that family provides the richest territory, for both fiction and nonfiction writers, and it's a territory that's also fraught with risk and challenges. So I thought it'd be a great topic of conversation for writers to focus on family and how you use it and the challenges and all that. So that's what we'll be talking about. I will take the liberty of introducing you guys for the mystery audience out there. So I'll just go in alphabetical order and start with Steph Cha. And Steph can wave. There you go. Steph, she's a novelist and a book reviewer, and you were a lawyer, but not anymore, right? And a relatively new mom. The author of 3 Juniper Song mysteries, Dead Soon Enough, Beware, Beware, and Follow Her Home. And she's also the author of the family-focused novel Your House Will Pay, which won the Los Angeles Times Book Prize and the California Book Award. It's an extraordinary book. It's very compelling, LA set book about justice, grief, race, and mostly family, to my reading of it. And she grew up in the Valley and lives in LA. Next up is Amy Meyerson, and Amy is the author of 2 novels, The Bookshop of Yesterdays, which is in 11 languages. Is that right now, Amy? I read that on your site. Anyway, been obviously done very well, and a very family-focused new one called The Imperfects, which I had literally just finished last night. I loved it. It's about as family as a family novel can get. And she's a creative writing professor at USC and a native of Philadelphia, but an LA resident now, of course. And her works have been published in a lot of literary magazines as well. Next up is J. Ryan Stradal, and fellow in the beanie. J. Ryan may be a Minnesota native and a writer who has set his fiction in the Midwest, but he's been a true Angelino for a long time. Active volunteer at 826 LA, which means a lot to our city, and worked in television as an editor for LA's Unnamed Press, and many other things. His debut novel, Kitchens of the Great Midwest, was a book I absolutely adored, as he knows. It was a New York Times bestseller. I wasn't the only one who adored it, and it's been published all around the world, I believe. Newest novel, The Logger Queen of Minnesota, is every bit as good as that first one. It also became a bestseller. And is it true that it's in development for possible TV? Is that right? That's what your bio says, J. Ryan. Anything happening?
That's all I can say.
Yeah. Well, we know how that challenging.
It's out of my hands.
Yeah, it's good to let it go of that. And then finally, Sergio Troncoso, who's in my lower left. He grew up in El Paso, a quarter mile from the Mexican border, son of Mexican immigrants. He became a Fulbright scholar and alumnus of both Harvard and Yale. And Sergio's published 6 books, including A Peculiar Kind of Immigrant Son, which is a collection of linked short stories on immigration. He's also the editor of 2 anthologies, including the outstanding new release Nepantla Familias. I keep struggling. That word is a challenging word for some reason. I don't know why. Familias, Nepantla Familias, an anthology of Mexican-American literature on families, focused on the family. And Sergio is the president of the Texas Institute of Letters and a teacher at the Yale Writers Workshop, and lives in New York and Connecticut, but you're in El Paso right now. So that's, yeah. And as for me, I'm the founder and editor of Prospect Park Books. So over my 15 years as a publisher, I was a writer before that. I published more than 100 books, ranging general fiction, mysteries, cookbooks, regional books, all kinds of things. I sold the company to Turner Publishing just earlier this year, and I'm working on the transition right now. So I'm no longer a publisher officially, although I'm still working on some books that were in the process. So After that, I'll get me ready for a new chapter in my life. We'll see. Possibly returning to my former life as a nonfiction writer. So that's who we all are, and so I thought we could start with the gravitational pull of family. One of the things I've seen in your writing is the how hard that is to resist, even when there's great conflict. So, Brian, in Lager Queen, you've got sisters who don't speak for forever. And Amy, in the Imperfects, you have a mother and one daughter not speaking to a brother for years as well. And family conflict and disconnecting is a common thing. But the gravitational pull is still there. There's still something. There's still, and it also has to. You can see in Amy, also in the Imperfects. There's just a small thing late in the book where the sisters have a sharp argument in front of Christian, one of the characters, and you make a little observation that Christian is dumbfounded by the way that they then just hug and are fine, because obviously he's an only child. Because he doesn't understand how you can be so mean to each other and then hug and be fine. So I wanted to know how you guys, all of you, your own experiences with siblings influenced your storytelling. Those of you who have siblings, I think, do any of you not have siblings? Do you all have siblings and yourselves?
Yep.
Okay. How that gravitational pull, I guess let's start with you, Jay Ryan, because I brought you up first, about the gravitational pull of siblings and how you use that in your writing, and what does that mean, like where people can not speak for years and yet have this bond?
Wow. Well, first of all, thanks for having me here, Colleen, and it's a real honor to be here with Amy and Steph and Sergio. It's a wonderful panel and great topic. That dynamic was inspired by relationships on both sides of my family. I'm descended on both sides from people who've experienced what they would regard as unfairly divided farmland inheritance. And in each case, it created a schism where, one case, sisters haven't spoken for decades. And one of the reasons I sat down to write Lager Queen was to try to find a way to reconcile that. I don't have that same situation with my own brother. My own brother and I get along very, very well. We're very different people, but I tremendously value my relationship with him, and I think he's a spectacular guy, and my life wouldn't be the same without him. I can't imagine what sort of scenario would emerge that would create silence between he and I, except for the death of one of us. But for my descendants, it was a little easier. Someone just had to be out of the country or unavailable the day that the farmland was divided up, or be viewed as someone who wasn't as helpful around the farm, or be the wrong gender. I saw that on both sides, and I'm related to an awful lot of people who don't talk to their siblings, and I figured I can't be alone in this. And if we write to relate to other people, that was one thing I wanted to relate.
Were you trying to resolve that for yourself? Like, how can you be siblings and not break that bond?
Yeah, I wanted to create a story where an unbridgeable divide, a seemingly unbridgeable divide, was bridged, for lack of a better verb. Yeah. I wanted to create the happy ending I didn't see in my own families.
So you didn't see that happy ending? That you made that up?
Well, my dad has managed to put siblings of his in the same room together that weren't speaking, and but in the case with my grandma and one of her sisters, no, they're still divided. There's still an ocean of silence between them to this day. Probably won't ever change. I mean, they went to the funeral of a sister, obviously the sister they share, at different times to avoid each other, that kind of thing. So if that wasn't going to do it, I don't know what would. So I sat down to think about situations like that, ways they could be resolved, and gave myself the challenge by putting it in the beer industry.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Maybe drinking will help.
Yeah.
So Amy, yeah, and Amy, in your case, I really did think of it as a gravitational pull because it's like in, out, in, out, in, out with the siblings and the mother. And you've got three in her novel. There are three siblings and a challenging mother and a grandmother, but the constant back and forth was that modeled on your own? Were you also trying to work something out the way Jay Ryan?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what Jay Ryan just said sort of resonates with me and my family. I'm close with my immediate family, although my mother and I definitely have one of those relationships where we can snap and then you don't need to apologize. It's just forgiven, which kind of confounds my partner that that's the way we interact with each other. But both of my parents have very frayed relationships with their siblings, and there's been estrangement in my family and stuff like that. So growing up, I was always envious of those big families that got together for events. We have a little bit of that, but it's more the kind of thing where you just see family, extended family, for those kinds of, Thanksgiving or the high holidays or something like that. So I kind of lost my train of thought, but so I do think it was modeled off the fact that I think in my immediate family, there's a lot of unconditional love. So in one moment you can be really strained with somebody, and then in the next there is that forgiveness. But my brother and I actually get along really well, and he lives in LA. And so I was not very nice to him when we were in high school. And I feel very grateful that he has since forgiven me for that. But yeah, I think the thing that interests me about families is that they're, for a lot of us, they're, one of the integral relationships or groups in our life, and they're really the primary one that we don't choose. So it's kind of inevitable that you'll have a lot of different people mixed together who obviously share some similarities, but a lot of differences too. And I think that's why it makes such, rich tension and scenes and.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And it's never been more clear than in the last few years with there's been so much attention about the political divide that within families and how that's a more extreme example, or has been in the last few years, but there's a million other things to be divided about. But there's also a generational divide, and I think that's something that I think you particularly see in like Steph and Sergio in some of your work with immigrant, and maybe with your own experience, immigrant parents and first generation children, and having a fairly significant generational divide. It's more exacerbated than it's always a generational divide. But wouldn't you say that it's more so in very commonly in, like, Steph, I've certainly thought in your House Pay, you see that, and even in your mysteries, you address that too in a lighter way. The challenge of the generational divide.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think that's something that has always been interesting to me. We live in the wealthiest country in the world, and for those of us who are like lucky enough to be born here, we're just like way ahead of a lot of the world's population just by having that American citizenship. And so many people who are born here as the first generation, like born in the States. I mean, we have just a vastly different upbringing from our parents, and some of our parents come from countries where there was like a military dictatorship, within like their lifetimes, or we're coming from conditions of extreme poverty. There's just like my parents' life experiences are just so enormously different from mine, and they came here to make sure that their kids had more opportunities and get better educations. And and I think like something that's interesting to me is I see this with because a lot of my friends are children of immigrants, and something that you see happening is like the children of immigrants who like get into like higher education become fluent in, not, obviously they're fluent in English, where like sometimes their parents are not, but also fluent in like the culture of of the U.S., you know, fluent in kind of that like, you know, the political fluency, I think is something that a lot of immigrant parents don't have, you know, and I think that a very common experience among, I know certainly like Korean American kids is like, you turn around and you judge your parents who like work so hard to like get you that education that like allows you to judge them. And like, you know, that's, I don't think that's something that is bad on us, but it's also an interesting dynamic. You know, I would be very upset if like I worked really hard to give my kid this great education and he turned around and like decided I was racist. You know, I think it's just kind of tough.
Right, and Sergio, same thing. I mean, you wrote very directly in your essay in the new anthology about the, you know, going to the Ivy League and the cultural divide, so that you learned that new language that your family did not have, right? That the language that Steph's talking about.
Yeah, and I think much of what Steph said is definitely resonates with me. I mean, the only difference is, you know, I grew up in extreme poverty in a shanty town in the United States. You know, and people don't think shanty towns exist in the United States, but they exist in Texas right now, actually. And, you know, where I grew up, we had kerosene lamps. We didn't have electricity. And we had an outhouse in the backyard. And this was the US of A. And my parents were Mexican immigrants. So, you know, starting from there and being a chubby kid on the border who loved books, and then going to Harvard and Yale separated me, you know, from my family in a very fundamental way. And there's that loneliness aspect to it as you know, navigate your way politically, culturally, you know, where you simply are trying, you know, you show up to Harvard and you can't believe this is a university, that you think the taxi driver is kidnapping you because he's taking you to a park. And he said, no, this is not a park. This is Harvard Square. This is the universities all around you. And you have Led Zeppelin t-shirts and bell-bottom jeans, and you don't even know where people eat. And so you're starting from less than nothing. In many ways. And, you know, and I mean, I became one of those parents who brought my kids to the Ivy League and introduced them to everything and make sure they have a bank account and all that. You know, my parents visited me once when I graduated. And when I showed up that first day, that they didn't have the money. And when I showed up that first day at Harvard Square, you know, I had 36 flautas from my mother wrapped in foil in ratty suitcases. And so this sort of fundamental cultural, economic divide, and then becoming an insider, you know, now teaching at Yale and being, and you know, you see the sordid, you don't buy into the whole Ivy League thing because you're still an outsider. I'm still the only Mexican American in my department. I'm still the only Mexican American as the board member of the Authors Guild. You know, you're still an outsider. And so at a certain point for me, being an outsider was painful, and you had to go through everything to overcome that. And sometimes you never do. But then when I started getting too comfortable, for me, it was keeping that edge, not getting too comfortable in Connecticut or at Yale or wherever you're at, because then you start drinking the Kool-Aid. You know, you start, you know, seeing, you know, starting to sort of assume this sort of racism or exclusion of poor people, that poor people aren't intelligent. You know, that's one of the things I've tried to counteract with every story I've ever written. And so this cultural divide that I think Steph Cha talks about, and economic, and really it's more than just all of that. It's simply just being separate from where your parents came. And I'm just going to add one last thing, because on the silences, my biggest silences were with my father. We didn't speak for 5 years because I did not like his machismo. I did not like how he treated women. I did not like how he treated my mother, who I thought was smarter than my father. And she was a reader, but she didn't have the opportunities. So for me, it was that clash. For me, that was the clash that defined, in many ways, my life.
And do you find that it still informs your writing?
Absolutely,
does that inform your
absolutely.
writing?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
I'm a goddamn feminist because of it. I mean, my muse has been my grandmother, my mother's mother, shot and killed 2 men who attempted to rape her during the Mexican Revolution as a teenager. She was my grandfather on my mother's side was a gardener, and if he didn't hand over the gardening money, she would take a broomstick and hit him on the head with it. So this was feminism before there was feminism, and she just had a very different perspective. And for me, that's the person that for me was my model, the person that informed my writing and how I should look at the world. This righteousness, deep righteousness about acting right, whether it's popular or not. That was my grandmother.
You know, so that leads me to a thought about what you said, Sergio, about being an outsider, and so you're always you go from being an insider within your family of origin, and that's the world you know, and then when you leave that, some people become more outside their family of origin than others, and you know, some stay quite close. I'm from a big Irish Catholic family. We don't stray too far. You know, I haven't had that much of an outsider feel that you would have had, say, with your father, for example. So how that I find that fascinating, in how, in terms of the stories you want to tell. But has it helped you be the observation, the ability to stand outside and look back on the culture, the family unit that you came from, and say, and I think about that, Steph, with what you've written about too, or whenever you get away, J. Ryan, when you were talking about you get away from once you're physically no longer with your family, you've come to Los Angeles and you can see from a distance, okay, why are these women not speaking? What is going on here? So is that notion of being an outsider help with the observation? Is it something you think about when you write these things? I don't know if any of you have thoughts on that. Steph, do you have thoughts on that? Being a Korean American kid, standing from the outside, looking at your family.
Yeah, you know, I feel like you know, maybe not as an outsider, but I kind of take the wide view on my family like quite a bit. I think part of it is like just being a novelist and thinking like a novelist. You are an observer, right? And so the point of view that you have is this like perch where you observe everything. So, you know, even when I look at like I mean, I can't help it. Like when I look at like the dynamics of my family, they're really complicated and they're really interesting, you know? And I kind of think like, you know, like one day I'll probably write a book about my weird dad, you know, like either it's just because I haven't seen a character like him. I mean, I think this is also why like family ends up being such a large influence on at least what I write, is that like, you don't know anybody better than your immediate family. You know, you're an observer of like the people that you live with. And so I think like the particularities of like family members kind of creep their way into fiction. You know, when I was writing all of my books really, but like, you know, when I was writing Your House Will Pay, like, you know, I've written, all my other books were from the point of view of a Korean American woman. And this one was half from a point of view of a Korean American woman, but the other half was from the POV of a Black man who's like middle-aged. And the way that I was able to connect with him, you know, just as like an initial starting point, was looking at like his sibling relationship with his sister, because I was like, okay, well, I have like a brother and like this is our age gap. And I was thinking about like the ways that we were with each other when we were like when we were kids versus like the way we are now. And I feel like having access to just like those family dynamics helped me unlock that character. And I think that I guess like, because everybody has family, you know, if we're talking about like, you know, I don't think like all novels have to be universal or whatever, but like there is something very universal about family dynamics. And I think people kind of viscerally connect when you write about family dynamics that are specific and interesting, you know, because I think like we very easily sympathize with like a daughter, with a father, you know, with these characters who are like, who populate our own lives, you know, even if it's so different different people filling those roles. Like there's a certain amount of like projection isn't quite right, but like there's identification because you recognize these figures from your own life.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Very true. Any other thoughts on this from any of the rest of you? It's so weird just looking at a screen. Jeez, I look forward to this day ending. We can't have the relaxed thing. Yeah. Well, okay. This leads me to when you said something about writing about your dad. I imagine this is something all of you have dealt with. It is true in nonfiction and fiction alike. The big risk of pissing off your family when they see themselves in there. Whether or not that really is them or not, I've known a number of writer friends who've had this issue where they write characters and somebody's convinced it's them, even if it's not, but it can be quite an issue if you're, are you going to write about your dad? If you want to write about your dad, Steph, while he's still alive, do you do that? How can you be honest? Sergio, you talk in your piece there about in the new book about the importance of telling the truth, but telling the truth about the people you love, or that even if it's characters loosely inspired by the people you love, seems risky. How do you guys handle that?
In my mind, my father died about 4 years ago, so that's part of it. He's not here, but much of what I wrote about him, he saw. I think we had that sort of relationship that he knew what I was writing about him, and I just think he accepted it. He said, "Can't control what I'm going to write," and I would try to be honest, because there's so many great things I learned from him, certainly about working hard. And by the way, this anthology that just came out, it really goes to this sort of central issue that certainly is part of the Mexican American experience, but I think it's actually part of every family experience, which is Nepantla is a Nahuatl word. It's an Aztec word that means living in between, in the middle ground, in the liminal space between Spanish and English, between Mexico and the US, between urban areas and rural areas. And I think a lot of these issues of who you become are worked through in the family, whether you leave your traditions behind or you borrow some things from your parents, and then you discard other things and you create your own values and you create a new identity. And I think this crossing of borders is I think something that I've always tried to explore philosophically. And somebody like Gloria Anzaldúa, who is certainly a philosophical mentor, but there are German and French philosophers who also talk about this in another word, not using Aztec words, but that they talk about how you create your own self and independence from your father, but yet I am also, as my own kids who grew up on the Upper West Side said, I'm the toughest father on the Upper West Side. So in a way, in an awful way, that I realized that I became my father on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. So there you go.
But you didn't have an irrigation ditch out back to make them.
No, I just gave them tons of
clean
homework when they didn't have homework.
Yeah. Well, I think that's.
You can never separate yourself in a way. I think.
But they have to, but there are issues of separating. So Amy and the Imperfects, did anybody in your family say, "Hey, that's me," or anybody get offended and say, "Did you write is that?" Do you have a flaky brother like Jake? Do you have a brother like that?
I know a lot of men like that. My brother is not like that at all. And I think, when you were speaking before, it reminded me of something my mentor in grad school, Judith Freeman, told me when I was writing maybe a little more closely to some of my own family members. She said, the people that you write about will never see themselves in your work, and the people that you don't write about always will. And so I've kept that with me a lot. And I think what that means is that, people see themselves in different ways than you see them. And so, for instance, in my first book, a lot of the relationship between the mother and daughter was similar to my own relationship with my mom, but on the surface, and I don't think my mom is watching this, so I feel a little better saying this, but on the surface, the mother is nothing like my mom in terms of her interests, her physical attributes. So my mom read that and said, oh, good, that's not me. So I think, it's obviously different if you're writing memoir or nonfiction or things that are really closely biographically similar. But for me, I tend to write characters who are composites of a few people that I know. So probably Helen, the grandmother, was the closest to my own grandmother, but I'm not sure that anyone else in my family would have seen that, because the ways that the strengths that I associate with my grandmother, I put into Helen, but I'm not sure that that was my dad's perception of her, because they had a very different relationship than I had with my grandmother, for instance. And sometimes I'm more interested in my friends' relationships with their mothers than I am in my own relationship with my mother, because I've explored it for my entire life. So it's fun to sometimes, you use your own experience to inform how you imagine. I mean, that's one of the benefits of fiction, right? How you imagine other people's relationships to be.
Right. Yeah. So that's one way around the issue of not having everybody mad at you at Thanksgiving because you skewered them in a
They might still be mad at me at
novel,
Thanksgiving, but not for this book.
Yeah. Well, but yeah, you're right. And I wonder if do you find that it's easier to observe other people's families? Like you said, your friends, to see your friends' mothers, there's going to be a different perspective than with your own fraught or good relationships with your parents, because we're going to have blinders on. I would think it's to a certain level. Is it easier to see with other people's families? Or
I think it's easier to get perspective on it, depending on how close you are. One of the things that I was really interested in with this novel is looking at how the same interaction is different from different people's perspectives. And that's, that's part of what makes, my own family's experience, the estrangements that we've had, I think that they grow out of love, not out of hate. And from talking to other people who've had estranged families, it seems that that's often common. It's certainly sustained differences, but that come out of inabilities to talk through things more so than this desire not to have someone in your life, and it gets frayed over time. But so I think with other people's families, you're able to impose your own opinions on them that are outside your relationship, and so sometimes that perspective can help create a more dynamic relationship between people, particularly if you're going into different perspectives, or certainly, a more balanced one, because it's easier to see, I think, with other people's relationships that both people can be wrong than when it's your own relationship with someone.
Yeah, no, it's true, and that's an interesting point. That your characters experiencing the same thing in different ways, and there is that. I've seen this as that Rashomon thing that can happen in families. In my case, I'm one of 6 siblings born in 7 years. We're basically a wolf pack, and I was so stunned at with 5 of us were together without our parents and without one sibling. So yes, we gossiped about him mercilessly, but after a few drinks, the talk got a little heavier, and it was so fascinating that how two siblings saw certain things that happened in our parents one way, and the other 3 saw it completely differently. And you think, how could we have such completely different perspectives, or care? Why are some carrying these issues all these years later when the others are like, oh, it's fine. What are you talking about? When we're basically Irish sextuplets, we had the same household, the same thing, but we didn't. So I think that's really a really interesting thing that you said that, and it's true. That's what your book deals with a lot. Is there how you can see things? The same people from the same gene pool and the same household don't see things the same. And I mean, is that something that you feel, Jay Ryan? You dealt with that too in your work, don't you think?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Definitely. I don't have a lot of nuclear families in my work, but the families that are created or do emerge through the the narrative, certainly don't always have a shared perspective on the trauma that shaped them or the joys that they choose. Yeah, they have different tastes and different desires. Absolutely.
I mean, there's a whole birth order thing too that I think is fascinating, and I don't know if the oldest, youngest, middle, and that there's certainly some truth to that, and you see that I see that in many people's writings, and Amy, you've got that. You have your firstborn, the oldest daughter, behaves in many ways like the oldest daughters do, and I'm one, so I know that's true, and so. That they're cliches, but they're cliches for a reason because they're based in some truth. There's something there. So tied to the family thing is the notion of home, and it's a very what the home means, and that's a different thing for the sense of home. And you guys have all written about this in various ways of it's a different meaning for say an immigrant who has left a homeland, but if somebody's gone from small town to a big city, or people who leave their hometown and some never do, but that sense of how have you guys the concept of home in your fiction, which is really what the core of family is that something you think about much? Anybody want to take that one on?
Well, I'll start because the home in my book is a literal house that 3 generations have lived in, and one of the things that I was really interested in the novel was about inheritance and how that brings out truths in a family. And while I was writing, I spoke to a lawyer who deals with inheritance, and she was telling me that even the most seemingly sound families, things come up with inheritance because the issue is about how people place different worth on the same thing. And I thought that was absolutely, especially true with the house, and that was kind of how I framed my characters' perspectives on it, is that how do you compare the relative worth of memories to a dollar amount, for instance, and I think that ends up manifesting in different ways in people's lives as well. But I think it really does center, in this case, it's also the inheritance of a diamond, but with the home, it's kind of this conflict between what that means as a collection of memories versus a place that you're emotionally attached to, and a place that could improve, or in this case also a diamond could improve your financial standings. And those kinds of conflicts really bring out people's not only their differences between each other, but their priorities in terms of how they view family, but also how they view money and family history and family artifacts and things like that.
Yeah.
That was half the answer. I started answering your question, then kind of straight.
Yeah. Any others you have thoughts on this concept of home and what that means, if you've explored that at all?
Yeah, well, most of my characters are somewhat swept along by fate, and as such don't become particularly sentimentally or practically attached to any location because it might be taken from them, or it might be just provisional. So for them, I think that's a home is more the family of choice they assemble in a location, and what their vocation might be, and the support and validation and sustenance they get from both emotional and financial, physical sustenance they get from the people in their location. Yeah, now that I think about it, I haven't really had a situation like Amy's where a house was particularly important to a family. Maybe it's because I moved like 7 times before I was 6. And it's just sort of ingrained in my family to not get too ingrained in my blood to not get too attached to a place, and just view places as well, this is where we are for now, and this is what this place will attempt to sustain us for however long we're here. For me, the notion of what a family associates themselves with tends to be a little more intangible.
So for me,
Yeah, that's really. So go ahead.
For me, the sense of home was always about shared values. And it was a much more philosophical sense of home, not a physical place and not material things, but it was how a group, starting, let's say, on the border for me, let's say in the novel From This Wicked Patch of Dust, how the siblings really try to recreate, but really also transform the values that they began, let's say, in a very rural, poor area. And as they go into the United States and become Americans, one of the siblings, for example, marries a Jewish woman. And so he starts transforming the values very far away from the border that he learned on the border in Boston, but borrowing and sharing from what he learns with this person that he's making a new home with. And then another sibling actually becomes Muslim and decides that she becomes a Chicana Muslim. And so she ends up in Iran. And so she is transforming the values she learned on the border with a family in Tehran. And so it's sort of Iranian Mex, but also something very different. And so it's about the shared values and how you transform those values in generation that creates that sense of I belong. And those values can come from, let's say, whether it's a rural area or very much of an outsider perspective. But as you sort of go through the world and find new places and new people to love, not just places to love, you start morphing these values into a sense of home. So for me, that's what it was. And it was sort of the transformation, but also the inheritance of values that people would take far from where they began, and not just far physically, but far culturally from where they began, to create a new place where they feel, yes, here I belong.
I write crime fiction, and that's a genre where setting and place matter a lot, and readers of the genre kind of expect vivid sense of place. But I think of place more on the city neighborhood level than at the home level. So that was actually an interesting question, because it kind of got me thinking about how I've treated this home space. I write almost exclusively about Los Angeles, which is where I grew up and it's where I live. I think of the city as my home, and I think all of the characters that I write think of LA as at least one of their homes. But on that kind of smaller family level, I guess in my books, my characters tend to be a little bit mobile. In my first 3 books, she lives in different places from book to book, and the families in Your House Will Pay, in the past they lived in one place and now they live in another neighborhood, so but I think that home is just is just where they're able to kind of settle down and feel comfortable, so I think that book starts with these 2 separate characters and their family lives, and so you kind of get to see them in their houses, because I do think we settle down and we nest and we kind of create as much comfort in our immediate space as we can. And I do like to see characters in their homes, just to see what their kind of base level is, what they're like when they're comfortable and with people they love. I think you obviously find out a lot about people by peeking in at their home lives. I think that's actually one of the reasons why this kind of year of Zoom has been interesting. You kind of get to peek into people's homes and see kind of the whatever chaos is going on there. Do they have pets? What kind of books do they have? What do they do with their books? It's just I think we're coming out of this year where we've been at home all the time, and I guess that has made me think more about kind of the importance of that immediate space. And I think we all get particular about about how we build that very personal area of our lives. And it's fun to read like a well-crafted narrative that like gives you a strong sense of that space.
Yeah, no, that's very true. So we got the 5-minute warning. We don't have much time. One of the, I suppose, a closing question. Amy, you don't have kids, do you?
I do. I have a 19-month-old son. Yeah, I think.
Oh, you do. So
Ryan and I are all young parents.
So all three of you are new parents, and Sergio, you've got old kids. Okay, so this applies to all of you, and it's probably more profound for the three of you who are new parents. The concept of family. Now that you're new parents, is this changing your what you're thinking about writing? You're writing in the future. Setting aside the fact that it's hard to find time and don't get enough sleep and all the practical aspects of, but that fact that you are now a parent, and Sergio, you've already been through this. Is that changing what you want to write about? How you're going to view family writing? Have you thought about that at all?
Well, I have. I have a 27-year-old and a 24-year-old. And I'll tell you how it's changing my life. The novel that I have coming out in 2022, Nobody's Pilgrim, is about young people saving the world. I'm really inspired by young people like my kids who, one of them is studying to be an environmental lawyer. He wants to save the planet before people burn it down, and he's doing the Appalachian Trail this summer. He loves to be outside. The other kid is heavily involved in Chicago politics. And because of what he sees as the problems that all these old people created and are leaving behind. So I'm inspired by them. So I'm writing my protagonists as like the 17, 18, 19, 20-year-olds. They're going to save the world. I hope they're going to save the world. And so I'm inspired by them. That's how it's changing my narratives.
I would say, I think like I haven't been able to write. I haven't started a new book because I just got childcare for the first time like this last week. But I think that it probably will influence what I write. I had this thought recently. My son broke out in hives, and it was the day that I got my second COVID vaccine. And I remember thinking how much I wish that like instead of him getting hives, I'd had like a really bad reaction to the vaccine. It was a new emotion, is what I'll say. And I think that parenthood has just kind of expanded my kind of palette. And so I can't imagine that won't have some kind of influence on my work.
Mm-hmm.
If it wasn't for my son, I wouldn't have written this one particular character in my third book who profoundly rejects about 95% of the world that her parents create for her. And for the better. I think she's extremely wise to do so. I can't wait to see our children burn down everything that this world deserves to reject. I think they'll be much more clear-headed than we were, and understand the emergencies around us for what they are, and be a lot more direct at resolving them. And so, I don't think I would have been inspired to write that character had I not had that hope for my son that he will see this world for what it is and create the world it ought to be that we've failed to make for him.
Let's hope.
Yeah.
Amy, you're in the same boat? Same thing?
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, I think it's interesting thinking back because mothers have been really strong not new mothers, but mothers in general have been strong characters in both my books. And I think I have even more empathy for those characters than I did before because there's just kind of what Steph was saying. There's a lot of new emotions with motherhood. And I think about death more than I used to, but in a very different way. It's not so much fear of my own death as like how that could impact somebody else, which I guess as a child, I don't know, I didn't think of it in the same way. So there's a lot of new emotions. And although it hasn't manifested yet in the book I'm working on now, there's no way that it can't, because I don't think you have to have kids to change and evolve over life, but certainly having children, I think really, at least for me, like very immediately changed a lot of my emotional core, I would say.
Yeah. Well, on that, I think they're going to shut us down any minute. I want to tell all of you out there watching to please read all these books. I've read them all. They are all so fantastic. I am so grateful for you guys to take time out of this rainy California Sunday to talk with the mystery readers out there. I mean, mystery meaning we aren't seeing them, but and hopefully some of them do like mysteries. And I think I think what's going to happen is they're just going to like cut us off. So that's